Hey, Gary, thanks for sending in this topic for our deep dive report, Language Landmines.
Yeah.
As a building consultant, I'm sure you've seen firsthand just how much trouble a few poorly chosen words can cause in an inspection report.
Oh, absolutely. It's incredible how something that seems so minor on paper can escalate into a major dispute or even legal trouble down the road.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to unpack today, the power of language and how to avoid those hidden traps that can turn a routine inspection into a communication nightmare. So let's just jump right in with our first landmine, shall we? Normal wear and tear. It seems harmless enough, but
But it's actually a breeding ground for misunderstandings because normal is totally subjective. What might seem like normal aging to one person could be a huge red flag to someone else.
absolutely. And that difference in perspective can have some pretty pricey consequences.
Hmm.
One example that comes to mind is a case where an inspector noted normal wear and tear on hardwood floors. Now, to the inspector, this probably meant just, a few minor scuffs consistent with the age of the floors. But the buyer interpreted it as move-in ready. And they were shocked to discover that they needed a $3,000 refinishing job.
Oof. Yeah, that's a classic example of why it's so important to be specific. Instead of just saying normal wear and tear, the inspector could have said something like, hardwood floors show moderate scratching and discoloration consistent with 15 years of use.
Right. Giving those concrete details makes all the difference.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to landmine number 2. And this one is a real doozy material defect versus defective material. They sound almost identical, but they have totally different meanings.
Yeah, this is one of those subtle distinctions that can cause a lot of confusion. Material defect refers to a problem with the actual material itself, something that could impact the structural integrity of the building. Like, let's say, a crack in a foundation wall that's caused by a weak concrete mix. That would be a material defect. On the other hand, defective material might describe a faulty component or product that can be easily replaced, like a cracked window pane due to a manufacturing flaw. So one's talking about the ingredient and the other is the final product.
Got it. That makes total sense. So misinterpreting this nuance could have a huge impact on a renovation budget, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's a case in the research where defective material in a foundation wall was completely misinterpreted. The buyer thought it was just a simple component issue and budgeted for some patching, but it turned out to be a material defect, which meant they needed a $25,000 structural reinforcement project.
Wow, that's a pretty big difference. Okay, moving on to landmine number 3. Minor issue. We've all been there, right? What seems insignificant to one person could be a major headache for someone else.
Exactly. And as inspectors, we have to be really careful not to minimize a problem just because it seems small to us. What might be a minor annoyance to a seasoned contractor could be a huge concern for a homeowner who's unfamiliar with building systems.
Yeah, dismissing something as a minor issue can create a false sense of security and lead to people neglecting problems that could get much worse over time.
Absolutely. And we've got a perfect example of that in the research back search. Hairline cracks in a basement wall were brushed off as a minor issue. Sounds pretty harmless, right? But they were actually a sign of underlying drainage issues. The buyer was reassured by that minor label and didn't address the problem. And guess what? They ended up with major water damage later on.
Oh man, that's a tough lesson to learn. So instead of slapping a minor label on something, it's so important to provide context, explain the potential consequences, and really empower those homeowners to make informed decisions.
I couldn't agree more. Even seemingly small issues can have big implications if they're not addressed properly.
Okay, let's move on to our next language landmine. Appears serviceable. It kind of feels like the inspector is tiptoeing around actually saying anything definitive.
Yeah, appears serviceable really doesn't tell you much about the actual condition of a component or how much life it has left. It's basically saying, well, it seems to be working okay for now, but who knows what's going to happen in the future.
Right, it's a recipe for unexpected breakdowns and costly repairs. And speaking of which, the research mentions a story about a 15-year-old water heater that appeared serviceable during the inspection.
Yeah.
But just a few months later, it completely gave out, leaving the buyers with a flooded basement and a hefty repair bill.
Ouch. That's why instead of using vague terms like that, it's so important to be specific. State the age of the component, any testing results, and its expected lifespan.
Yeah, give those homeowners a realistic picture, not just a snapshot in time. Help them understand that, hey, this water heater might be on its last legs, so you should start budgeting for a replacement.
Exactly. Manage those expectations and empower homeowners to plan proactively.
Great advice. Okay, let's move on to our 5th language landmine. No visible signs of... This one almost feels like a shield. an attempt to protect the inspector from liability.
It might seem that way, but it can actually backfire and create even more confusion about what was actually assessed during the inspection.
Right, because it only addresses what's visible and doesn't account for any hidden issues. The research highlights a case where an inspector reported no visible signs of termites. But the catch was that they had very limited access to the crawl space.
And of course, that's exactly where they discovered significant termite damage later on. That no visible signs statement gave the buyers a false sense of security and potentially delayed some crucial interventions.
So instead of using this vague phrasing, it's much better to be upfront about any limitations to the inspection. If there was restricted access, clearly state that and recommend further evaluation once access is granted.
I agree. Transparency is key. It protects both the inspector and the homeowner by setting clear expectations from the start.
Absolutely. And that open communication can prevent a lot of headaches down the road. So let's move on to landmine number 6, functioning properly. This one seems pretty straightforward, but there's a hidden danger here, almost like an unspoken promise that can come back to bite you.
Right. It sounds like the inspector is guaranteeing that the system will continue to work perfectly, which of course no one can actually do. Things break sometimes unexpectedly.
Exactly. And no inspector can predict the future. Implying that a system will always work just because it's fine during the inspection is setting yourself up for trouble.
The research actually mentions a case where an HVAC system was marked as functioning properly during a winter inspection, which, seems logical. But then summer rolled around and the AC unit died, leading to a big dispute about whether the inspection was actually thorough. Yeah, that's a classic example of how expectations can clash with reality. Instead of implying a guarantee, it's much safer to be upfront about the testing conditions and acknowledge that things can and do break down. The inspector in that case could have said something like, the heating system was tested and is working properly, but the AC unit could not be evaluated because of the cold weather. I recommend a follow-up assessment during warmer months.
That's a much clearer and more responsible approach. Okay, let's unpack landmine number 7. The perils of absolute terms like always and never. In the world of building systems, those words can be a real recipe for disaster.
You got it. Using absolutes in an inspection report is incredibly risky. Building systems are complex and things can change depending on a ton of different factors. What's true in one situation might not be true in another.
Right, and the research actually gives a perfect example of this. An inspector confidently stated that a particular type of foundation never needed waterproofing in that climate. But then they got hit with a record rainfall and surprise, surprise, the basement flooded.
Yeah, that bold never definitely came back to haunt them. It just goes to show why it's so important to avoid those absolutes and use more qualified language. Instead of never, they could have said, this foundation typically performs well in our climate, but it's still a good idea to keep an eye out for any signs of moisture, especially during periods of heavy rain.
Much better. Acknowledging that there are always exceptions and encouraging ongoing monitoring is key. Okay, let's move on to landmine number 8. Industry standard, or code compliant. These phrases seem pretty straightforward, but they can actually be a bit tricky.
The problem is that codes and industry standards are constantly evolving. What was acceptable a few years ago might not meet the requirements today. It's like using an outdated map to navigate a city that's always changing.
That's a great analogy. You're bound to run into some roadblocks if you're not using the most up-to-date information. And speaking of roadblocks, the research mentions a case where an inspector flagged some stairs as not code compliant because of the riser height.
Yeah.
Turns out the stairs were perfectly compliant with the codes that were in effect when the house was built.
Yep, and that's why it's so important to reference the specific codes and dates that you're using. If something doesn't meet the current standards, explain the potential implications, but also acknowledge that it might have been acceptable at the time of construction.
So basically provide context and avoid unnecessary alarm.
Got it. Okay, let's delve into landmine number 9, poor workmanship. This one seems like a real minefield of subjectivity.
It is. Poor workmanship is such a vague criticism. It doesn't pinpoint the specific problem and leaves a lot of room for interpretation, which can lead to disagreements and complications.
And I imagine it could also lead to a lot of unnecessary work being done. If the criticism isn't specific, it's hard to know what needs to be fixed and what can be left alone. The research actually mentions a case where poor workmanship was noted for some bathroom tile installation. That vague assessment led to a complete renovation of the bathroom when all that was really needed was a few minor repairs. Wow, talk about overkill. That's a perfect illustration of how unclear communication can waste a lot of time, money, and effort. Instead of relying on subjective terms like that, stick to observable facts. provide measurements, describe specific deviations from standards, and explain how those issues might impact the functionality of the component.
So ditch the vague opinions and stick to the hard facts. Makes sense. Okay, we've reached our final landmine, in need of repair. This one seems pretty clear-cut, but I can see how it might lack a sense of urgency and potentially downplay the severity of a problem.
You're right, in need of repair doesn't really convey the potential consequences of neglecting the issue. A homeowner might see that phrase and think, I'll get around to it eventually, but some repairs really can't wait.
The research is a perfect example of this. Some gutters were noted as in need of repair. The homeowner didn't see it as an urgent issue and procrastinated. Unfortunately, those neglected gutters ended up causing water damage and foundation problems.
Oof, yeah, that's a tough lesson to learn. That's why it's so important to clearly communicate the severity of the issue and give the homeowner a realistic time frame for taking action. Instead of just saying, in need of repair, be more specific about the potential consequences of delaying the repair.
Right, so instead of gutters are in need of repair, you could say something like, the gutters are clogged and pulling away from the fascia.
Ugh.
This is causing water to overflow and erode the soil along the foundation. To prevent further structural damage, these gutters need to be repaired immediately.
Exactly. That sense of urgency and the specific details can make all the difference in motivating a homeowner to take action and prevent a small problem from becoming a major headache down the road.
We've really dug into these 10 common report language landmines and how even seemingly harmless phrases can lead to confusion, disputes, and some serious legal headaches. As a building consultant, firsthand, that clear communication is absolutely crucial in this industry.
Oh, it's essential. And it's fascinating to me how those small wording choices can have such a huge impact. It's almost like, the butterfly effect. One little flap of the wings can cause a hurricane on the other side of the world.
That's a great analogy. We've talked about the importance of clear descriptions, avoiding absolutes, and managing expectations. But how does all of this tie into an inspector's overall credibility and reputation?
That's such a good point. An inspector's report is really their calling card. It's a reflection of their expertise and professionalism. A report that's full of vague language or those landmines we've been discussing can really raise some red flags about their competence. It's kind of like showing up for a job interview wearing a wrinkled suit and mismatched shoes.
Yeah, not exactly a great first impression.
Exactly. But on the flip side, a well-written report, one that's clear, concise, and informative, can really boost an inspector's reputation. It shows that they know their stuff, they pay attention to detail, and they're committed to clear communication.
So it's not just about avoiding those negative consequences, it's also about actively building a strong professional image.
Absolutely. And in a field like building inspection, trust and credibility are everything. A solid reputation can attract new clients, build stronger relationships with existing ones, and ultimately lead to a more successful business.
So investing in clear communication isn't just an ethical responsibility, it's a smart business move.
I completely agree. It's a win-win for everyone involved, the inspector, the homeowner, and the industry as a whole.
Great points. Remember, clear communication is the foundation for a solid foundation, both literally and figuratively. Until next time, stay informed, stay safe, keep those reports crystal clear.